So it's about the science of nature and the nature of science in the 19th century. The point I'm trying to make here is that the view we have of the 19th century, especially 19th century Spanish science, is very much based on inherited American views. And I think nobody's really ever stopped to challenge that concept. Now, of course, when we're looking at modern science, we all know that DNA is the bearer of genetic information, but most of the 19th century, the views were very different. They were really dominated by concepts of acclimatization, that organisms adjust to their climate and physical environment, and that these characteristics not are passed on or acquired by their progeny, but might be. And of course, the classic one, and it's gone from the picture, actually here is a giraffe with its neck stretched out, in other words, to eat. So in other words, the idea that an animal who's feeding on foliage stretches its neck continually, and that this becomes an acquired characteristic and therefore might be passed on to its progeny in due time. Now, the extent to which organisms flourished or failed in tropical environments was of a central concern to European imperial states during the 19th century. This was a matter of hot debate and very much something that concerned the state. Whether, in what time, and how organisms acclimatized to new climatic conditions were very much debated concepts. And those who supported acclimatization favored European settlement beyond the continent. They were very much in favor of actually European settlement in those places. And those who held that, inverted commas, races degenerated in tropical environments were much more proponents of exploitation, a colonial exploitation, rather than actual settlement. These debates were initially focused on North America, but shifted more to tropical latitudes in the late 18th and 19th century, to India, Southeast Asia, and then, of course, ultimately, finally, to Africa. Climatization was a concern, as I said, in all imperial capitals, but the debate lay especially strongly in France. French scholars were very much concerned with debating how life evolved. And central to their notion of evolution was an 18th century inversion of the classical model of all life as being the great chain of being, that things descended in order from the most perfect to the most rudimentary, of course, the most perfect being God himself, and that, this went right down to the most rudimentary kind of things, and replacing with schemes of ascending perfectibility from the simplest to the more complex. Where there were interruptions in this chain is where you got evolution, or how they envisaged the idea of evolution, things trying to strive towards perfectibility, things becoming more complicated as they ascended the ladder of life. And here we have to think about, in particular, the work of Buffon, the great French naturalist, and his mammoth Histoire Naturelle raised the issue of organic evolution, and expressed very serious doubts about the immutability of species. The figure that's most important in this, in the 19th century, is the work of one of Buffon's protégés, Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, claimed that in his examination of animals, it revealed a marked progressive complication in the structure of organisms. That in organisms' efforts to adapt to change in circumstances affected animals' forms over time, and that these structural characteristics might be passed on to their offerings. Now, Lamarck's ideas were initially ridiculed, but they gradually reached a much wider audience, especially through one of his students, Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire was most important, and even under Stalin in the Soviet Union actually reaches the status of a state-sponsored ideology with the works of Ivan Vladimirovich Michurin. His ideas were very much based on acclimatization. So what I'm trying to depict here is that in the 19th century, we have a tale of two cities, basically. On the one hand, we have French and the French influence, Lamarck, Buffon, the notions of acclimatization, Paris being recognized in the first part of the 19th century as the center of research, the center of debate and scholarship. But gradually, as the century progresses, and especially after the publication of Darwin's Origins of Species in 1859, that focus begins to shift northward to the UK, to Britain, which then, from then onwards, becomes, and I would argue still is, in that sense, Darwinian notions of evolution. Darwin, of course, breaks decisively with the evolutionary concepts of Lamarck. Initially, he dismissed them as nonsense and veritable rubbish. Actually, in his later life, he not exactly entertains or condones Lamarckian ideas, but he's more accepting that in some cases, actually, they may have veracity. The difference between the two lay in the responsibility each ascribed to historical contingency in elaborating present forms of living creatures. To Lamarck, it plays no role at all as an individual organism's tendency towards progressive complexification accounts basically for its principal transformation of its structures within the animal kingdom. To Darwin, of course, it's absolutely the primary force responsible for the evolution of species. Darwin holds that organisms whose random variation better adapted them to an environment than others were better able to reproduce and therefore compete for scarce resources. And this is what we basically hold now as the premises of our idea. And late 19th century advances in cytology, especially the work of Weismann's research on hereditary, just seem to reconcile with the idea of natural selection and serve to further discredit any idea that acquired characteristics were inherited. So where does the Philippines fit into this then? I mean, and that's the point that we're really trying to get into. So I wanted to depict this debate, these shifts in concepts of acclimatization and evolution that are taking place in Western science, and then to consider where the Spanish Philippines fits in all this. Well, physically, geographically, it may have been at the edge of Western natural science, basically due to its political meteorological geography, the way knowledge transferred from Europe to the Philippines, of course, was across the Atlantic by mule to Mexico City, by mule then to Acapulco, and then across the Pacific. So it could take 18 months. It was a very long process, and knowledge was filtered all the time in that place. But the point I'm hopefully going to make is the relative seclusion of the Philippines at the end of this long line of sailing routes meant or did not mean that the natural sciences that were practiced here were purely derivative and only a faint reflection of their European counterparts. If we start looking at natural science in the Philippines, in the Spanish Philippines, what can we say about it? Well, I mean, there are obvious qualifications one has to make. There were few practitioners, there were few men of science at all in the colony. They generally lacked modern equipment. They were perennially strapped for funding, probably sounds more like the modern Philippines today, but you know, it's very similar in that sense. But if we start looking at what they did and their exploits, we can see that actually there was a sort of virility in the science that was practiced here, perhaps based on the hybridity of its struggle to make sense of what they regarded, or what Spaniards regarded as an alien environment, the tropical environment. Nor did it mean that the natural sciences practiced here were purely derivative. There were small but significant advances made in the fields of forestry and botany. Greater heights were reached in meteorology, so that by the late 19th century, the Philippines is an integral part of a Far Eastern early warning system advising shipping of forthcoming typhoons. In fact, in many ways, it's the linchpin in the network. And one can very much see the influence of current European thought in the debates over acclimatization. I've done a lot of work on the horse, for instance, in this respect, and the debates there, as I will show, are very interesting in that respect. Who was the promoter and instigator of most of this search? Well, actually, the prime instigator and promoter of scientific inquiry was the colonial state, the moribund colonial state, the friocracy that is usually depicted as being, backward and primitive and so on. So let's only briefly, this is a scan of some of the work that I've been doing over the last 30 years, looking at some of these aspects. I've just put them all together here to show you the kinds of scientific inquiry that were going on in the 19th century. First of all, in terms of forestry, most of the islands, perhaps 90% more, were covered in forest in 1521. But over time, trees were felled, in particular to make way for agriculture, but also to provide the principal construction material for domestic and public buildings, for shipbuilding, industrial purposes, cigar boxes, whatever, and also cleared for resin gatherers and charcoal manufacturers. It was partly the scale of this destruction that led to the establishment of the Inspección General de Montes in 1863, the Spanish colonial forestry department in the Philippines, incidentally at least a decade ahead of the equivalent being founded in the United States, just as an aside, to point that out, which actually achieved some remarkable achievements despite its chronic shortage of manpower and funds, etc., in the 30 or 40 years that it was in existence. It carried out the first systematic survey of the archipelago's forests, identifying principal species growing in each province and the proportion of land still timbered. That was in 1876. Luckily, we actually have that. We have the evidence of that. It also described local forest conditions, and a series of detailed provincial maps were drawn up, forestry maps, alas, all lost in the end of the 19th century because they were burnt when the botanical gardens and the actual, I can't remember what it's called, Institute of Agronomy or whatever it was burnt down during the fighting in the revolution. All this was lost. And because it's lost, people think it's not there. It wasn't ever there, but that was drawn up. I've been searching in Spain for years, hoping that perhaps copies of these maps were sent to Spain. I've had no success, so I don't know. As I said, perhaps as much as 50% of all the area under Spanish control, not in the entire Philippines, because of course Mindanao was not really incorporated into the Spanish Philippines. 50% of the forest had disappeared by the end of the Spanish period. But it wasn't just simply in terms of surveying and cartographical skills that the work of the Inspección de Montes has been overlooked. There's also the scientific contribution of a number of foresters in the 19th century. I've just highlighted two here, perhaps the most important. Sebastián Vidal y Soler, who did a study of flora and fauna in Mindanao as part of one of his surveys as well, is the first recognized necessity of comparing specimens with material held in European botanical collections and wrote numerous publications on flora, very informative, and on forestry, very informative. And the work of Ramon Jordana y Morera, the most important of the Spanish administrators of the forestry department, engineered, responsible for its major expansion, a prominent contribution to natural history. In particular, he wrote a comparative history of forestry in the Netherlands, East Indies, India, and again, I have no idea why this is not a more widely read or recognized piece. Well, it's in Spanish, of course, but it seems to me very surprising. And I remember actually producing one of my great friends, who's alas now dead, Peter Baumhart, who was very much interested in forestry in the Netherlands, East Indies, and I pointed out this work to him, and he'd never even heard of it. Yeah, it's interesting. What's interesting when we actually look at, when the Americans come in here, and they start looking at it, I mean, before this leyenda negra gets going, is that I have a US official concluding that Spanish forestry regulations were, quote, excellent, practical, and in line with the most advanced forest legislation of Europe, where forestry had reached a high state of development. Of course, the big problem, as it is in the contemporary Philippines, you have law and you have practice. So the degree to which this would carry out. But, on the surface, at least, we have a very sophisticated forestry department. What about botany, then? Well, there's a long tradition of botanical inquiry dating from the 17th century in the islands. Many of the naturalists were, of course, priests from the religious orders. Initial studies were mainly or largely concerned with the medicinal qualities of plants, and the first paper of any importance on the colony's flora appeared in 1704. Findings were continually sent to London, unfortunately, most of this work, even though it was written in the 17th and 18th century, wasn't published till the 19th century. They remained as manuscripts in the religious orders, and it was only really in the 19th century that things that had been written 150 years ago actually were published and come to light. Like the 17th century treatise on medicinal plants by Father Ignacio de Mercado, which wasn't published till 1880, and that's just one example. There are frequent examples of this. The most notable work, as I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, is Father Manuel Blanco's Flora de Filipinas, which was published in 1837, which was the most comprehensive study of flora in the islands. It was subsequently revised by various other, actually priests as well, because it was a lot of mistakes in it initially throughout the 19th century. Interest in indigenous flora culminated in the establishment in Manila of the Manila Botanical Gardens in 1858, including a school of botany and agriculture. This is 1858, The zeal of its initial directors ensured a successful introduction of a considerable number of exotic species. They were very interested in the economic potential of introducing exotic plants and of experiments in plant culture. And I think a particularly notable achievement of these early years was the publication of an elementary textbook on agriculture, La Cartilla de Agricultura Filipina, which was intended for school use. And again, what I'm trying to show is that this was science that was actually trying to reach out and be more accessible to the population at large. According to its catalogues, in 1890, the botanical gardens contained as nearly 1,400 different plant varieties or species. Again, all lost in the revolution to fire and destruction. So again, wiped from largely, I mean, we know that, you all know there's the botanical gardens here, but perhaps not the sophistication with which it actually operated during the 19th century. Meteorology, as I said early on, most significant contribution, I think, if we're looking at science in the 19th century in the Philippines, the establishment of the Manila Observatory in 1865 under the energetic directorship of Father Federico Fara, the issuing of the first correct typhoon warning in 1879, in which he predicted the course of a typhoon, and that's what happened, and ships were able to actually avoid it or stay in port or something like that. Led to the establishment by 1884 of 13 meteorological stations linked again by the newly established telegraphic system. I'm not looking at industrial or those kinds of scientific advances, but partly the effectiveness of the meteorological system depended on the establishment of a telegraph system. And in fact, the telegraph office and the meteorological station were usually one and the same thing. And that spreads gradually in the late 19th century into the Visayas as well, outside of Luzon. And really, I think we can look at the creation of the first proper meteorological service in the Far East, having been founded in the Philippines and based on Manila. We know that this is the case in the sense of its importance because we have a telegram from the British Governor General of Hong Kong in 1880 pleading with the Governor General of the Philippines to connect themselves up to the Manila Observatory, because they really wanted the warnings of typhoons that for the South China Sea. And in fact, in 1880, it is through Bolinao station there, the Pacific cable, underwater cable, linking the Manila Observatory. And you can see here, Manila was then linked progressively to other important colonial and non-colonial capitals throughout the course of the 19th century. The point to stress here, however, is that Manila was the linchpin in this network. This was the most important station. This is what the others largely depended on for their warning, their advance warnings. It wasn't just this work on typhoon and signaling that was very important and very instrumental, but the staff at the Manila Observatory were more than collators of data and were also pioneers in instrument improvement and design for tropical conditions. So again, they received international acclaim for this, for the instrument design, the barocyclometer, and the refraction nephoscope of Father Jose Alge, very important, received, as I said, international recognition in exhibitions like the Madrid Exposición Filipina in Madrid, the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, and the Universal Exposition in 1900. And these people were recognized as leaders in meteorology, in instrument development, etc. And there's also a very hefty, which we luckily do have, corpus of scientific writings left by Jesuits and others on meteorology, seismology, and volcanology. Seismology is another thing we could be looking at. The importance of the Philippines in the 19th century in developing seismology in relationship with Japan in that particular case. Okay, what about debates about acclimatization? As I said, what's interesting here, and I've done a lot of work on the shrinking horse in the Philippines, why the horse shrank. But what's really interests me in the debates about this is the familiarity with current debates in scientific theory among senior ranks of the colonial military. I mean, you don't expect military officers to be conversant, well, certainly I didn't, in the science of acclimatization in the night, but they're fully conversant with it. The debates are really interesting when you read through the accounts. Why were they so concerned? Well, because it was like the cavalry were the tanks of the 19th century, and if your tanks got progressively smaller and smaller, so that they couldn't even carry a European armed soldier, then you had a problem, and you couldn't pull cannon along. You had a big problem. So they were very concerned about increasing the size of the horse. So you get all these debates about why the horse has shrunk and how can you actually increase its size. And it led to at least 2, probably more, unsuccessful attempts made during the 19th century to improve the size of military mounts by crossing native mares with imported, and you get an enormously racialized debate too about native females and imported male stallions and things. It's a wonderful kind of debate, but it's very social Darwinian, but it's also totally conversant with notions of acclimatization. As I said, debates held among senior engineering, artillery, veterinary, and cavalry officers who were a special commission convened in 1883 to recommend steps for improving the breed, reveal a very easy conversance with the notions of Lamarckian acclimatization ideas, fully conversant with it, and familiarity with zootechny or scientific breeding techniques to obtain what they wanted to do was the appropriate animal for particular services, this idea of that you could engineer an animal. And a special military commission recommended the comprehensive establishment of comprehensive breeding schemes with state-stocked farms and acclimatization centers, which were put into effect. These farms were set up, and I mean, it wasn't very successful, but then the Americans weren't any more really successful when they came. But the point I'm trying to say, these kinds of established and scientific establishments were set up during the 19th century. Final point, architecture and fire. Colonial Manila was originally 2 cities, a city of intramuros of stone and wood, largely inhabited by Spaniards, but with a large substratum of indigenous people, and extramuros, a city of nipa palm and bamboo, where most of the indigenous people lived. And these 2 cities represent very different cultural adaptations to the twin hazards of earthquake and fire. In the permanent city of stone and wood, it represented a form of adaptive technology to manage these hazards. The central issue is if you build in light materials which is good for earthquakes and doesn't kill you when an earthquake happens, it tends to burn and you lose your city. If you build in stone, which is great against fire, and then there's an earthquake, it kills you when it falls down. So there's this continual to and throwing about architecture and how to adapt architectural forms to accommodate these twin hazards. So the Spanish tried to do it through legislation, the use of materials, and relatively quite successfully, actually, I might add. I mean, the syncretic architecture that evolves in the 19th century is pretty good in terms of seismic, against seismic risks. And then you get an entirely different kind of technology in outside of intramuros, in the more indigenous parts of the city, the much larger part of the city, which favored basically the idea of disposable structures. When a fire happened, you didn't try to save the structure because that could easily be put back in a day or two. It was the insides you took out. So what was the point of fighting a fire? You removed your goods and let the fire sweep through, and then you rebuilt the structure and put it out. Spaniards could never understand this. And you have these amazing scenes where Spanish soldiers are trying to, with a gunpoint, make indigenous people fight fires, because they just can't understand why are these people not fighting the fire, But anyhow, so 2 very different kinds of technology here. The rise of Manila's population in the 19th century and the blurring of boundaries between intra and extramuros, again, the advent of major fires in more Spanish parts of the city prompted colonial administrators to new attempts to manage hazard through further agriculture adaptation and stricter control over the denizens of the ephemeral city beyond. Point I want to stress here again, just to illustrate the technological innovations that are going on, is in firefighting, which I think is quite interesting. I have to qualify this remark by saying, of course, the Spaniards only thought that, what they call stone houses or major houses were worth saving. They didn't think indigenous houses were worth saving at all. So, but we get zoning on the right bank of the Pasig, the creation of fire breaks, segregation of Nipo and stone houses, and then in 1870, the establishment of a professional firefighting force in the Philippines, and a system of fire hydrants fed by existing freshwater pipe grid, bamboo pipes, and the creation of a force of hydraulic engineers, the Fontaneros de Carriedo, charged with them. So we get the establishment of a modern, at the time, modern fire service. Again, all lost. All, we just have the diagrams. That's all we have left. Okay, I'll leave that there. I mean, the point is that, again, I just want to stress the fire service there. So what's my argument here? Well, my argument is not that the Philippines was a hitherto unacknowledged center of research and activity. It certainly wasn't, but neither was it a scientific desert. That's the point I'm trying to make. It wasn't a scientific desert. Far from being a priest-ridden society mired in superstition, it was actually often those men themselves that were at the forefront of scientific inquiry. The Jesuits in particular played an enormous role in this. I mean, they may be priests, but they're also scientists. And it was the same moribund colonial state that funded important centers of inquiry, such as the Manila Botanical Gardens. Again, when you look at reports about late 19th century Spanish state, it's never anything positive ever written about it. Yet the US found a very different society in 1889 when they imposed their own colonial rule upon the archipelago. I think the explanation may lie in the nature of scientific traditions found in Spain and the United States. Both of them were derivative colonial sciences, but from different traditions. Science in the Hispanic world was rooted in French cultural traditions, given the unparalleled French achievements in science during the late 18th and 19th century, which was carried over from France, again, very much through the Bourbon connection, but just because of the cultural tradition from Spain, and then from Spain to Spain's colonies in the Pacific, such as the Philippines. Science in the US remained within the orbit of Britain well into the 20th century. First of all, the notions of utilitarian natural philosophy, but then with the origins of species, which began to challenge that and eventually eclipsed it. But we get this dominance of Darwinian thought about evolution and such like. So my argument basically is the Spanish-American War and the occupation of the Philippines not only constituted a collision of two imperial systems, but actually one in decline and the other an ascendant, but also an encounter between two kinds of natural sciences, colonial natural sciences, one influenced by France and one more by Britain. The English and then the American authorities become progressively less enthusiastic during the course of the 19th century about French theories. I mean, unless you're actually a student of science, you probably never bothered to read about Lamarck and ideas of acclimatization. And the late 19th century is often erroneously cast as a period of decline in the French natural sciences, and their significant contribution to evolutionary theories are ignored and undervalued, leading Richard Somerset to conclude that the demise basically of French science is, quote, a myth whose origin can be attributed to the domination of the field by Anglo-Saxon historians who have tended to write Darwin's French precursors out of their history, end quote. So what the Americans then found when they occupied the archipelago was only a faint echo of a scientific tradition that they were already disparaging and had disparaged in their own right. And so naturally, they give rise to this new idea that everything was primitive and backward and that they were the bearers of a new light and such like. So that's my paper. As I said, it was written at least 15 years ago. What are a couple of the things that perhaps if I was writing this now, that I would, in a sense, highlight or that I had ignored? And I think the first thing, and it's something that when I discuss it with my students at Ateneo, is how do we assess Spanish science and Spaniards in the Philippines in the 19th century? You know, are they Spaniards? Are they just colonial? Or are they part of some sort of Filipino scientific tradition? And I think that's a really difficult one to actually come to grips with, because they're both, of course, in many ways. You know, but where do we fit? Because I mean, my talk has all been about basically Spanish men, you know, which raises the next question: what about indigenous science? Where's that? Where do we find that in the archives? I mean, we know that most of the foresters were indigenous. We know that plant collectors were undoubtedly indigenous, that the Manila observatory staff, and especially the ones in the provinces, were all trained local staff. The stockmen were undoubtedly local. The firefighting force was actually, you know, manned or staffed by fire. So where is the indigenous science? We have hints of it in the fire, beginning to see hints of a different scientific tradition going on there. But I think, you know, you'd really want to make that much more prominent. And then the final question, the one that I always find almost impossible to have, if I've made all this argument, what the hell happened to it? What happened to the tradition of innovation in the Philippines? It doesn't seem to be there. It's certainly when I ask my students, you know, how they depict science in the Philippines today, and they're always negative about it. You know, it's basically a pale reflection of American science. I mean, you know, so what happened to this enormous innovative tradition, which I've just tried to highlight a little in my talk? And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Indy found your talk very interesting. Very. All right, so now we'll open the floor to questions. Ellen.
The other thing I was wondering all the way through your talk was, what about the other great traditions that were here? I mean, I know you're focused on natural science and sort of European tradition, but I mean, we also had sultanates here.
Sure.
And we also had Chinese trade, and we know that they knew people were trading a lot of specific types of plants and animals as well. So, what about these other large traditions that were interacting with this area?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, with the sultanates, I could argue that I'm really talking about the Spanish Philippines, and a lot of the sultanates are not really integrated. But the Chinese is a great question. And actually, one of the things that I've never had enough data to actually write a paper on is the role of what Spaniards called blacksmiths in the 19th century, which were basically, I have this wonderful chart of a horse, and it's in Chinese with Chinese characters on it, for the use of acupuncture in the treatment of horses. And there's a whole thing about what were known as blacksmiths. And again, during the 19th century, the Spanish are trying to professionalize a veterinary service. So they're very dismissive of it. But it's quite clear that actually people, when something was wrong with their horses, wanted the blacksmiths to come to treat them. And a lot of those were Chinese. So we clearly have, again, another alternate tradition. Whether you'd like to call it Chinese or whether, again, it's a sort of, syncretic, I don't know. But yes, clearly, I mean, all I'm trying to say here is that it's not this moribund society. Basically, there's a whole lot of things going on. It's not world science, but it ain't nothing either. And it's quite interesting because it's growing out of a hybridity of the local environment and the mixture of cultures. And I think, it just gets swept away. I mean, I don't know. If you think about Spanish science, have you ever even thought about Spanish science in the Philippines? You probably have a very negative view of it. Yes, Victor.
Fascinating, Frank. There's so much I want to discuss with you, but just following up with Helen, the other tradition that I'm sure you're aware of it is the role of the Germans after 1870, where they came big time and they inserted a lot of Northern European Darwinian traditions of appreciating evolutionary processes, and they were naturalists, collectors. They're best represented by Semper and Yavor at the beginning. And their accounts, and I'm getting this all, of course, from Weston's work, the fellow who published all this fantastic research on the specter of Germany, published by the Press, and a couple of articles in the previous studies. But it is clear, according to him, that the Spaniards were taking the Germany in the technical part of their applying what they were bringing in, rather than countering it. The other point is, of course, you didn't have to, but maybe another explanation why seemingly Spanish science has such a low profile is a very deliberate and conscious effort of the friars, of the church. In many accounts, for example, of liberals trying to change the system, they get torpedoed, the politics of Spain in the 19th century, and nothing really flies. So educational reforms were slow at best, and the church was very conservative and against the integration of a secular kind of learning with science. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that I would agree with the priests were particularly taking a low profile. I think they were, maybe in some cases, education, of course, is a highly contentious issue because of religion. But in things like the Manila Observatory, I don't see that at all. I really don't see that. They're the Jesuits, but I don't see that. And I think maybe we have to differentiate according to orders. I don't know. Maybe that is the case because most of the people I have been talking about who are priests have been Jesuits. But then I don't think that necessarily negates it. Education is difficult because of the religious connotations that are associated with it. As for the Germans, that's interesting. I'm in the debates. I see no mention of any German. They're not there at all. Maybe so, but as I said, we have various scientific commissions at the period for various different things. And there's no, they're actually not talking, they're not mentioning Lamarck by name necessarily, but it's just quite clearly that their concepts and ideas are formed around those kinds of ideas. I don't see any other influence in there at all.
I think they're more in the evolutionary theology part. Not very specific, which of course leads into physical anthropology, the entire pension of collecting, this kind of social Darwinism arguments of the late 19th century.
Yeah, the late 19th century.
Because like virtue was involved, all of this big words, German science, in all of this. But that's
okay, good point, Yes, well, you have to, I know you're not Spanish, but you have the representative derivative of Spain.
I have lived in my life in South America, Spain, now the Philippines, so connecting what Victor was telling about the priest, that is interesting thing I noticed in the third realms I have lived, and it's how perfect continuous debate in themselves about the science, by one side, by one side, sacred writings in the other side, in the minds of the priest, right? But whatever you see them, they are in the forefront of research in these three places I found, particularly in archaeology, for example. They are the first going to explore caves, take interest on them, and try to bring interest to the locals. In Spain itself, I've been in Madrid, there in the Basque Country, and one of the first ones exploring caves in the Cantabria region, priests of different orders, not even just Jesuits. Then I remember that same was in Peru, where I started living, and in the Philippines now that I am going towards exploring regions like Samar, for example, again, writing by priests.
But this is later though, is it? This is not I've never seen any 19th.
Later.
Yeah.
But regarding natural history accountings, priests again there, like Ancina, for example, they have this.
Oh well, okay. If you're going, you're claiming him as an archaeologist, are you?
Not an archaeologist. In this case, a natural historian.
Well, okay.
Just commenting on that.
Yeah.
Naturalist.
Yeah, naturally. Yeah, I guess. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
But I agree with you with the leyenda negra, the second one. And the Americans were very deliberate
Yeah, I think so.
to eradicate anything that the Spaniards contributed. To the point, and I argued it in that paper that they gave for Paris, in that journal that's still that the Filipino scholars were the ones who invented the oil. Magellan discovered the Philippines. Because if you look at all the textbooks by the early Americans, they never said that. They were really eradicating anything that Spanish had. It's like a flip, it's kind of othering in a sense.
What's really interesting with the Americans is, of course, they come in, they think there's nothing there. And then in most of the things that I've been talking about, like forestry and such like, actually they find that they need to draw on former Spanish employees, or I mean, in this case, many of them local employees, because to actually understand how the system worked and what was there. So, for instance, in forestry, I have this wonderful potted history of the Spanish forestry department and its successes, which is written by one of the local foresters, but for the Americans, because he's been asked to write it. He's been employed in the new American Bureau of Forestry, and he's asked to actually, well, tell us what actually you did, and then it has the American foresters' annotations on the actual document. Oh, really? Did they do this? This kind of stuff. Yeah, that's right. So I think actually, quite to a certain extent, the Americans build on the Spanish system that is there, but at the same time negating that it actually contributed. So it's a sort of dual idea. And I'm not trying to paint Spain as a peon of progress. I just think that we do have a very negative, underestimated view of what was going on. Yeah.
In the learned circles, people do, American scientists, scholars knew about. But in archaeology, we've been doing everything to find out if there were archaeologists.
Yeah, no, I asked Grace whether there were any archaeology under Spain, because I'd never heard of anything. But
was the governor, at least in the closest to antiquarian, governor of Bicol, that's all. Governor Guerra. But talking about your point that they were not derivative of Moribund, Blanco, Father Blanco is a good example. Why is he criticized? He's criticized because he wasn't following the same leyenda.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
He was in the field, He knew the basic Linnaean system, and he was just being criticized that he wasn't following that convention at the time. And so he was stubborn about it.
No, that's a very good point, actually, Victor.
Who are you to tell me? I'm the one who knows. That's it.
Anybody else have any other questions?
I have a minor point on. Could you go to that slide of with the the technology on a fire. Yes, yes. I think, Greg, that is a water dispenser of the waterworks of the Korean waterworks. 1881 if I'm not mistaken. Is there lion drawn or it's cast iron, right?
It's cast iron, yeah.
It's a faucet made in Scotland.
But we know there were hydrants, though.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
I mean,
so there were the water dispensers for the.
I don't know whether they were the kind of hydrants that you connected a hose to, or whether they simply just provided water. Provided water. But I mean, they were.
We studied the waterworks.
All right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting with the hydraulic engineers is the debate about, so what should these guys be doing when they're not fighting a fire? We're paying them just to sit around waiting for a fire. So they actually had to do the maintenance of the streets, too. They cleaned the streets and things like that, because that was something they could be doing if they weren't fighting a fire. No, but I mean, it was a very cash-strapped society. But the point is, they had these institutions, and they had these networks. Yes, okay.
I do believe we're coming up on time.
Right.
I think we have to end things there. But before we do go, we have just announced the two upcoming BINALOT talks, the one on Monday by manual leaders, which I'm not sure if we have the topic this yet, but again, pay attention to our social media, website, wherever you get information about that. Oh, okay, Joey, before we end things, there is actually one last question.
Sorry.
Online.
From Father Fowler.
Yes, so there is one question. Since the colonial Spanish was so influenced by the French natural history philosophy, have they ever tried to establish any museum of natural history in the Philippines?
Yeah.
Ooh. I don't know. Not that I.
Ateneo and UST.
Yeah, but it's not. What? Based on French science? No.
Oh,
No. That's what I think the question is asking. No. No. The answer is no, as far as I'm aware. Yeah.
But if your thesis is correct, then it's natural. That's easy to start. Just wanted to study to see the plan how they created it. I wish always Darwinian.
I'm sure there's a student here who would like to do that. It's all American period, isn't it? I can't think of. I don't know of any museum under Spain, not that I'm aware of. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just as a matter of interest, have any of you studied acclimatization? Does Lamarck mean anything to you, or is he just a,
Giraffe.
Giraffes, yes.
The examples are.
Okay.
There's always issues with domestication.
Yeah.
Is that an example of sort of acclimatization?
Yeah. But how was it presented when it was taught?
As an alternative.
Oh, okay.
But not separate.
Yeah.
It's dominion.
Yeah.
But I think in anthropology, I have people in this institution,
Yeah.
you have Russian science, they also still use that. There is that article on the foxes, remember
Yeah.
And they make a good guess. Right? So there was actually an article in the National Geographic Monopoly ideas, within the Mediterranean Institute.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a data at this point, I have a mixture.
Yeah, okay.
But only that specific applications.
I mean, I think in many ways, I mean, modern and contemporary environmentalism has actually more in tune with Lamarckian ideas in many ways than so I'd be curious to see whether it comes back as in terms of reassessment in how people think about.
What about your shrinking horse discourse? For the Spaniards, did you encounter any of them saying like a almost Lamarckian?
Oh yes, no, I mean, the debate about the shrinking horse is purely Lamarckian. Purely Lamarckian. I mean, and as their solution to it is as well. No, I mean, that's what I mean. They're well versed in that kind of ideas because that's what they've been trained in. That's, you know, that it's natural. That's their ideas. Yeah. Anyhow. Okay.
After that, if you have any more questions, you can forward them to Greg, or if you have any more questions or comments that you'd like to make in the meeting. But for now, we can officially end things there.
What was the second talk?
Yes, the second talk is by a lecturer at the UP Institute of Islamic Studies. That's a very interesting talk by Mr. Mohammed. And his talk is entitled Indigenous Perspective on House of Resistance. So, take you there next.
When is that?